There's a specific kind of quiet that isn't really quiet at all. You know the one. It sits in the room with you, takes up space, breathes. Two people who used to fill every silence with something, a joke, a question, a hand reaching across a table, and now there's just this nothing sent, nothing received. And somehow that nothing feels louder than any argument you've ever had. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually. Not in an abstract way. I was talking to someone last week over coffee, the kind of conversation that starts about something else entirely and ends up somewhere you didn't expect. And they described it like this. They said the silence felt like standing in a hallway, hand on a door that might be locked, and not being able to bring yourself to try the handle, because if it's locked, then you know, and knowing changes everything. That image stayed with me, because it captures something most people don't say out loud, that the silence isn't the problem. The terror of what the silence is confirming, that's the thing. Someone goes quiet. You go quiet back. Maybe out of pride, maybe out of exhaustion, and then both of you are in that hallway. Days pass, and somewhere in that stretch of time, one of you is going to crack, not because they're weak, but because most people were never taught what to do with this kind of pressure. Stoic philosophy doesn't promise you a way out of discomfort. What it offers is something more useful, a way to stand inside it without losing yourself. If that's the kind of conversation you're looking for, staying around here might be worth your time. What most people do with that silence is misread it entirely. They see a standoff. They see two people dug in, waiting. They tell themselves it's about pride, about who blinks first, about winning something. And I understand that reading it's the obvious one. But it's also the one that keeps you stuck in a loop that doesn't end well for either person. Here's what's actually happening, and I want to be careful how I say this because I've gotten it wrong myself in the past. Actually, let me try again. What the silence is most of the time is not a battle. It's a reckoning. It's two people who have run out of the words they were using to hold something together, and now they're standing in what's left. That's different. That's not a war. That's gravity doing its job. Think about someone you know, or maybe this is you, who had a falling out with a close friend. Not a dramatic explosion, just a gradual withdrawal, messages that got shorter, plans that didn't get made, and then one day you realize neither of you has reached out in 3 weeks, and there's this dense silence sitting between you like a piece of furniture nobody wants to move. You're not angry, exactly. You're not sad, exactly. You're just suspended. And underneath that suspension is a heavy truth you haven't said out loud yet. You don't know if this friendship still means what it used to mean. That's what mutual silence actually is. It's not two people being stubborn. It's two people confronting something they haven't found language for yet. The body knows this before the mind admits it, that tight feeling across the chest when you see their name somewhere, the slight hesitation before you open an app, the way your sleep changes, not dramatically, just slightly off, like a piece of furniture that's been moved 2 inches and you keep almost tripping over it in the dark. Stoic thought, and I'm not going to dress this up in formal language right now, has always been interested in what happens when you stop running from the thing that's true, not in a punishing way. More like, you can only work with what's real. And the real thing here is that silence between two people is almost never empty. It's full. It's rooted in every unspoken conversation that didn't happen, every moment where someone chose to say nothing instead of something. Understanding that changes how you stand inside it. So the silence is information. Fine. Most people can accept that intellectually. The problem is that accepting something intellectually and actually sitting with it in your body are two completely different experiences. Because what happens in the hours and days after that silence settles in is not a calm philosophical process. It's closer to a slow pressure building somewhere behind your sternum. And at some point, usually late, usually when your defenses are lowest, that pressure needs somewhere to go. So you pick up your phone, you type something, maybe you delete it, maybe you don't. Maybe you send a message framed as something casual, something unburdened, like you just happen to think of them, like it costs you nothing. But it isn't casual, and it does cost you something. And some part of you knows that before you hit send, you just couldn't stay in the silence 1 more hour. I don't say that with judgment. I genuinely don't. I've been that person most people have, if they're being straight about it. The manufactured reason to reach out. The question you didn't actually need an answer to. The hey, just checking in that was really please acknowledge that I still exist to you. This is what that move does. It doesn't release the pressure. It just relocates it. Now you're not waiting in silence, you're waiting for a reply, which is somehow worse. You've traded one kind of tension for something more exposed, more untethered. You've handed the next move to someone else entirely, and whatever sovereign ground you were standing on quietly disappears the moment you pressed send. The silence wasn't the trap. That was. Nobody warns you about this part. Not the silence itself. Not even the anxiety that builds inside it. The part nobody mentions is what gets redistributed the moment you act from that anxious place, and how permanent that redistribution tends to be. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me step back for a second, because I think there's something else operating underneath all of this that I haven't named clearly yet. When you break first out of fear, you don't just send a message, you send a signal, and the other person receives it, whether they consciously process it or not. The signal is this: I need this resolved more than I need to hold my ground. And once that's been transmitted, once it's out there in the open, no amount of explaining or reframing or following up with something cooler changes what was already communicated. You can't unsend the version of yourself that cracked. I want to sit with that for a second, because I think people underestimate how much this cost them. Not morally. I'm not talking about fault or blame. I mean structurally. In terms of how the dynamic actually functions after that moment. Think about a situation at work. Two colleagues who've had a falling out over something. A decision that went badly, credit that wasn't shared, something that left a wound neither of them addressed directly. So they go quiet with each other, professional on the surface, but hollow underneath. And then one of them, unable to carry the weight of the tension any longer, sends an email. Friendly, reasonable, a hand extended. On paper it looks mature. But what it also does is reveal exactly how much that person needed the discomfort to end. And from that point forward, the other person knows something they didn't know before. They know where the threshold is. They know how long it takes. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It becomes part of how every future interaction gets calibrated. This is what desperation actually costs. Not the moment itself. The moment feels like relief, briefly. It's the aftermath. The quiet shift in how you're perceived, in how you perceive yourself. That slight loss of backbone that you feel but can't quite name. The way you walk into the next conversation a little less grounded than you walked into the one before it. Actually, and I want to be honest here because I think I was about to oversimplify this, it's not always about perception. Sometimes the person on the other end isn't even strategic about it. They're not sitting there thinking, now I have leverage. They might genuinely be relieved to hear from you. But something still shifts. Because you know what you did. You know you didn't hold the line. And that internal knowledge, the way it quietly adjusts your own sense of steadiness, is often more damaging than anything the other person does or doesn't do in response. Seneca wrote, and I'll paraphrase because the exact words matter less than the idea that a person who is disturbed by external things has already conceded something essential about where their stability lives. And that's precisely what acting from panic reveals, that your quiet confidence, your sense of being okay, was contingent on something outside yourself, on a reply, on resolution, on the other person making a move that releases you from the discomfort of not knowing, the weight of your own presence, the unshakable quality that makes people take you seriously, that makes you take yourself seriously. That weight is built in moments exactly like this one. Not in the easy moments, in the ones where everything in you is screaming to reach out, and you carry yourself through it anyway. So if acting from panic costs you something real, the question that follows naturally is, what does it look like to not do that? What's the alternative? And I think this is where most people get it wrong, because they assume the opposite of panic is coldness, distance, shutting down, some kind of calculated stillness that's really just a different flavor of avoidance. It isn't. The opposite of panic is clarity. And clarity requires that you actually read what the silence is telling you, instead of running from it. Marcus Aurelius came back to this idea repeatedly, not in dramatic terms, but in the quiet, almost surgical way he talked to himself in his private writings. The idea that what disturbs you is not the thing itself, but your interpretation of it. The silence isn't the problem. Your reading of the silence is, and your reading is only going to be accurate if you're composed enough to look at it unflinchingly. Here's what I mean in practical terms. Someone goes through a period of no contact with a family member, not by formal decision, just by accumulation. Visits that didn't happen, calls that got shorter, and then nothing. And in that silence, if they're honest, they start to see things they couldn't see when the relationship was active and loud. They see how much of the connection was built on obligation rather than genuine want. They see which one of them always initiated. They see what the relationship actually was, underneath what they'd been telling themselves it was. That's not comfortable. I won't pretend it is. But it's real. And there's something almost patient about letting that clarity come to you instead of chasing noise to drown it out. I don't have a clean answer for what you do with what the silence reveals. That depends entirely on what it reveals. But I do think the deliberate act of staying still long enough to actually read it without flinching, without rushing to resolve the discomfort, is one of the more underrated forms of self-mastery available to anyone. It asks something of you. It asks you to be more interested in what's true than in what's comfortable. And most people, if they're being measured about it, aren't quite there yet. Neither was I, for a long time. And staying still long enough to read it, that's where most people hit a wall. Because there's a difference between holding the line and just freezing, between disciplined presence and paralysis dressed up as patience. And if you've ever been in the middle of one of these silences, you know the two can feel identical from the inside. The question I get stuck on, and I'm not sure I have a fully clean answer to this, is how do you actually live inside a silence without being consumed by it? How do you stay present with yourself when the absence of the other person keeps pulling your attention outward? I think the honest answer, stripped down to what actually works rather than what sounds good, is structure, not as a distraction, not as a way to avoid the weight of what's happening, but as a way to stay anchored in what's real and within reach. Someone going through a long stretch of silence with a person they were close to, no dramatic falling out, just the kind of drift that happens when something fundamental breaks down and neither person knows how to address it, and what keeps them from completely unraveling isn't therapy or journaling or any particular technique. It's the fact that they kept showing up to things. They kept their commitments. They cooked actual meals instead of just eating whatever required the least effort. They went to bed at a reasonable hour. Small things, bone-deep ordinary things. But those ordinary things created a kind of internal gravity that the silence couldn't fully erode. This is what Epictetus was pointing at when he kept returning to the dichotomy between what's in your control and what isn't. It sounds almost too simple when you say it plainly. But the practice of it, actually redirecting your energy away from the unanswerable question of what the other person is thinking or feeling, and back toward the texture of your own day, that practice is genuinely hard. It requires a kind of raw honesty about where your attention keeps going, and a willingness to bring it back, repeatedly, without drama. Because here's the thing about silence. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. If you don't fill yours with something intentional, your mind will fill it with scenarios, with reconstructed conversations, with interpretations that get darker every time you revisit them at 2 in the morning. You'll start to see through every memory with suspicion, wondering what was real and what wasn't. And that spiral doesn't produce clarity, it produces noise dressed up as insight. The undeniable truth, and I use that word carefully because I don't love absolutes, is that you cannot think your way through this kind of silence. You have to live your way through it. One day, one commitment, one small act of self-respect at a time. Not because it makes the silence go away, but because it keeps you intact while the silence does whatever it needs to do. And arriving on the other side of this with yourself still in one piece, no illusions, no borrowed narratives about what happened, that matters more than most people give it credit for. Something shifts when you get there. Not dramatically, not in a way you'd necessarily notice on a Tuesday afternoon, but it happens. When you actually arrive at a place where the silence stops being a wound and starts being just a fact, not because you told yourself to be okay, not because you journaled your way into acceptance, but because you genuinely stopped needing it to resolve, something in the whole dynamic changes. And I find this part difficult to explain without sounding like I'm describing magic, which I'm not, so let me try to be precise about it. People respond differently to someone who needs nothing from them. Not theoretically, in practice, in real time, in the texture of ordinary exchanges. You can feel neediness in a conversation. It has a kind of pull to it, a slight pressure that the other person registers, even if they never consciously name it. And you can feel its absence too. There's a different quality to someone who has genuinely stopped orbiting an outcome. It's not coldness, it's not distance. It's closer to a kind of weight that doesn't shift depending on what the other person does next. I've seen this play out, and I want to be honest that it doesn't always resolve the way you'd want it to. Sometimes the silence just ends, and both people move on, and that's that. But I've also watched someone spend weeks rebuilding their own life during a period of no contact, genuinely stop waiting, genuinely stop checking, and then have the other person return almost confused about what had changed. Nothing strategic had happened. No move was made. The gravitational center had just shifted, and the other person felt it without being able to explain why. Here's where I want to be careful, because this is the part that gets misused. Detachment is not a technique you deploy to get a reaction. The moment you treat it as one, it becomes performance, and performance doesn't have weight. It doesn't have that rooted, anchored quality that actually changes how someone experiences you. Real detachment is what happens after you've done the hard internal work, and by then, honestly, you're usually not thinking about the other person much at all, which is precisely what makes it immovable. And that's the thing that tends to get lost in all of this. The whole conversation about silence, about who moves first, about dynamics and detachment, it can start to feel like it's about the other person. Like the goal is to position yourself correctly relative to them, to win something, to provoke a particular response or reclaim some ground that was lost. But somewhere in the middle of doing the actual work, the unglamorous, day-by-day work of staying intact while something uncertain plays out, the target shifts, quietly, without announcement. I think about someone who spent months trying to figure out how to handle a falling out with someone they'd been close to for years. They read things, they thought things through, they had long conversations with people they trusted, and at some point they realized they'd stopped thinking about how to handle the situation and started just living. Not as a strategy, not as a performance of moving on. They were just awake in their own life again, genuinely present in it, making decisions based on what they actually wanted, rather than what might look a certain way to someone who wasn't even watching. That's the moment I find most interesting. Not the dramatic resolution, not the conversation that finally happens or doesn't happen. That quiet internal reorientation, where you stop being a satellite orbiting someone else's silence and become the thing at the center of your own life again. There's a line, I'm paraphrasing because I don't want to get precious about exact wording, from Epictetus, who had a habit of cutting straight to the bone on this kind of thing, who had a returning to the idea that a person who requires external events to go a certain way in order to feel okay has already handed over the most essential thing they possess. Not dignity in some abstract sense. The actual felt experience of being unburdened, of moving through your day without that low hum of waiting underneath everything. That's what this is really about. Not winning the silence, not engineering a particular outcome. Becoming someone for whom the outcome, whatever it is, doesn't determine the answer to the question of who you are. Someone who wakes up and feels, in some real and unperformed way, sovereign in their own interior, uncaged from the need for the other person's next move to tell them something about their own worth. I want to be clear about that because I think the way these things get talked about sometimes makes it sound like you flip a switch and suddenly you're fine. You're not. It's more like a direction you keep choosing. Some days easily, some days with everything you've got. But the choosing itself, repeated often enough, is what builds the kind of person who doesn't need the silence to end to know exactly where they stand. 6 months from now, you'll probably be in another silence with someone. Maybe a different person, maybe the same one. That's just how it goes. The difference is whether you'll know what you're standing in, whether you'll be able to feel the panic rising and recognize it for what it is before it makes your decisions for you, whether you'll have enough of yourself built back up through the ordinary days, the kept commitments, the small acts of not abandoning your own structure to just wait, not because waiting is a tactic, because you no longer need it to end on any particular schedule. That's it. That's the whole thing. There's no secret underneath it. No advanced technique I held back for a later video. You already have everything you need to do this. You just have to decide, repeatedly, that your own steadiness matters more than the relief of a reply. If this conversation meant something to you, not in a vague way, but in the way where something actually shifted while you were listening, subscribing to the channel is free, and it keeps this kind of content coming. Like the video, if something landed, and right after you like it, a hype button appears. That one's easy to miss, but it matters. Click it if you're willing. Take care of yourself out there.